You know what can really make or break the stories in Xenoblade? The villains. Some of the best moments in the series would have never happened if it wasn't for the amazing antagonists of each game. And in this video, I'm looking at the 5 best of them. This ranking is of course just my opinion. These are the villains that I personally find the most interesting, and I'm basically making this video so I can fanboy about them. So, let me be clear on this, I will go into spoiler territory for every character that I mention. And finally, I'll go over some honorable mentions right before I'll get to my number 1. But enough stalling, let's now talk about the 5 best Xenoblade antagonists. Xenoblade X might not be known for having an interesting narrative, but there is one character that is almost single-handedly responsible for one of the only good storylines in this game. If you're planning to play X blindly someday, I highly recommend skipping this part of the video. I know some people say that the story in X is bad, but believe me, some parts are worth experiencing for yourself. So, the one character that really stole the spotlight here is without a doubt Lao. But let me start by saying, his betrayal is not surprising in the slightest. He keeps acting suspiciously for 2 chapters and then the game actually just spells out for you that he's probably a spy for the enemy. On the bright side, thanks to that painfully obvious foreshadowing, Lao's reasons for his betrayal are properly explored. Throughout the whole game, Lao's family is a touchy subject to him. He only had one reason to join Project Exodus. He was hoping his wife and daughter would have a bigger chance to be chosen to come aboard as well. This never happened, and his family was left behind on Earth when it got destroyed. Lao is clearly still struggling to cope with this. His life has basically become meaningless to him, and yet he wouldn't even be able to put an end to it, since he would just wake up in a new Moebius body. It makes complete sense that he feels depressed, but the final straw is when he learns he was lied to. Lao eventually finds out that the people who joined Project Exodus were decided upon from the very beginning. His wife and daughter were never even considered. All places were reserved for the rich, the well-connected, and the talented people they could exploit. Upon learning this, Lao becomes a spy for the enemy and steals information crucial for saving the human race. By doing this, Lao dooms everyone, including himself, so he's basically getting revenge by dragging everyone down with him. Those goals are extreme of course, but they do make sense for Lao's character. It's believable that he feels trapped, that he has those bitter feelings inside of him, and that this is the only way out he could see, at least for a while. After fighting him, Lao does come to his senses again when he sees Lin sticking up for him. It's a satisfying conclusion to the father-daughter relationship they've built up throughout the game, and with this, Lao's role as an antagonist ends here. But thankfully, that's not the last we see of him. During the final boss, he shows up out of nowhere to stab the main villain through the back, showing that you did get through to him. I'm telling you, every time the story of X focuses on Lao, it becomes 100 times more hype and intriguing. He might have a relatively simple and short character arc, but it was still effective. It also helps that both his dialogue and voice acting are on point. Lao has some of the hardest lines in the entirety of X, and some great voice acting from Matt Mercer. You might know him as the voice of Tears of the Kingdom Ganondorf, or Chrom from Fire Emblem, or Yusuke from Persona 5, or Sigma from Zero Time Dilemma, or Nahyuta from Ace Attorney, or Yosuke from Overwatch. Lao is only against you for a short time, but it serves as a great payoff for his and Lin's character arc. You can say he's more of an anti-hero, but I'd say he still counts as an antagonist, even if it's only for 1 chapter. But his short time as your opponent is why he's only number 5. Whenever I talked about Xenoblade Chronicles X on this channel in the past, I would usually make a joke about us never getting a port and the cliffhanger ending never getting resolved. But now I'll just say, I can't wait to see what role Lao will play in Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition. There are plenty of villains in this series with tragic origin stories. Some bad guys might be irredeemable and pure evil, but others can be seen as victims of the harsh worlds they live in. And I can think of no better example of a tragic villain than Jin. He definitely starts off as one of the more mysterious characters in Xenoblade 2. I mean, you know he's evil because he straight up kills the main character in chapter 1, but you don't interact with him again for a long time after that. But when you do see Jin again in chapter 5, it becomes clear there has to be more to him than meets the eye. He shows emotion for the first time after killing Fan, and Mithra even reveals that she and Jin used to fight together against Malos once. This really makes you wonder what happened to him, which is focused on in the later chapters of Xenoblade 2 as well as in Torna, the Golden Country. This is just my interpretation, but I always saw Jin in Torna as kind and protective towards the people he trusts, but cynical towards most other humans. I mean, the very first thing he ever witnessed was a 10-year-old being threatened by her stepfather. Yeah, I could not imagine a worse first impression of humankind. It was always Laura that had to urge him on to believe in others, and it's obvious how much their relationship meant to him. So, when Laura's life was suddenly about to end, and Jin realized he would be reborn without any memories of her, it understandably broke him. Out of desperation, he absorbed his driver's heart and became a flesh eater. With this, Jin basically cursed himself. He has to keep living on to honor Laura's memory, but without any purpose left in his life. Some unspecified time later, he joins up with Malos, which makes Jin more interesting, but also more confusing. It makes complete sense that Jin loses his faith in humans after Laura dies, but it's still a big step up to go from simply hating humans to wanting to destroy the entire world. There is also the question of why Jin even wants to connect with someone like Malos. Even after beating the game, some people might still think it doesn't make a lot of sense. But I do think that you can find several good reasons for this in the entire story, though some of those reasons are more hidden in subtext than others. Again, this is just my point of view, but Jin always seemed like a cynical person, so especially after Laura died, I could see Jin eventually agreeing with Malos' goals. There is also one random line that perfectly summarizes Jin and Malos' motivations. After being rescued from Morifa, Jin proclaims that the architect only created blades to be used by humans. This mindset is part of the whole reason they want to eliminate their creator and his world responsible for Jin's suffering. You can point to even more reasons, but the main explanation the game sticks to is that Malos simply reached out to Jin at his lowest point. Eventually they came to see eye to eye, and they then made a promise to destroy the world together, which gave both of them a new sense of purpose. While it might seem cheesy that they value a simple promise so much, I actually like it. It represents this connection they have that keeps both of them going, and even though Jin realizes this goes fully against what Laura wanted, he still wants to remain loyal to Malos. This culminates in one specific scene in the World Tree, where Jin just can't go through with their plan anymore. He then sees a sad-looking Laura before him, showing just how guilty he feels for going against her wishes. I'm telling you, this scene never fails to give me chills. Jin has to be one of the most tragic and interesting characters in the whole series. And yet, he's still only at number 4 in this video. What the heck, right? Well, it's not like Jin did anything that makes me hate him. It's just that there are 3 other villains that I like more than him, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. For now though, I'll just say that I completely understand why some people would place Jin closer to number 1. The competition is just very strong. The Xenoblade games often change who the main villain is throughout the story. It makes sense to give the player stronger and stronger opponents, but sometimes a new antagonist can also drastically change the story, like with Egil from the first Xenoblade. He technically appears as early as Shulk's first vision, but his first on-screen appearance is only around the halfway point of the game. From that moment, however, Egil completely changes the story. For the first half of Xenoblade, all Mechon are made out to be either soulless robots or bloodthirsty killers. But from the moment Egil introduces himself, it becomes clear that the Mechonis might not be the pure evil you thought it was. Eventually, you learn that it wasn't Egil or anyone from the Mechonis that started the war. Instead, it was the god of the Bionis, Zanza. Egil used to be a kind person that lived in peace with the people of Bionis, but he could never forgive Zanza for his attack. Very much like Shulk, Egil became completely obsessed with taking revenge, and it changed him. Despite only being after Zanza, Egil still started attacking the Homzan Bionis, since he saw them as nothing but food for the titan they're living on. And so, by being so focused on his revenge, Egil inflicted the exact same pain he suffered onto Shulk, Melia, and countless of other people. This is amazing writing, and to add on to this, I love the parallels between Shulk and Egil. Both of them had their homes destroyed by someone from the other Titan, and both refused to listen to their own friends telling them to let their grudges go. Egil basically shows how Shulk would have turned out if Fiora never snapped him out of his pursuit of vengeance. I also like that Egil still thinks he has some kind of noble intentions. He used to live in a peaceful era, and originally he only wanted things to go back to the way they were. The problem is that he convinced himself that destroying the Bionis and the Monado is the only way to achieve that peace again. It's actually sad to think about how corrupted Egil's mind became with wanting revenge. He took it so far that no other Machina wants to associate with him. His own father asks you to kill him. Egil doesn't even listen to the very goddess he worshipped for centuries and just calls her a traitor for not helping him with his plan. Poetically, it's only Shulk that can get through to him, after he had to resist all urges of Zanza within him. Shulk's speech about losing himself in anger and him saying he will stop Egil until they understand each other is just perfect. It feels believable that these words strike a chord with Egil, and with this, peace is finally restored between the two titans. But whoops, we still haven't fought against any gods in this JRPG! Let's bring Zanza back! Egil becomes someone you root for so quickly after all of this happens. Of course, he's the first person that tries to fight Zanza, but now it's no longer to simply get revenge on him. Sure, Egil still hates him, but it's clear that Shulk gave him hope for a peaceful future between the Bionis and Mechonis. In the end, Egil gets fatally wounded in this battle, but with his final actions, he sacrifices himself so the main characters can get away from Zanza. I was originally going to put Egil on number 4 instead of Jin. The latter is more complex and fleshed out, but I personally just love how essential Egil is for the narrative of Xenoblade 1. He just embodies the game's themes of revenge and learning to understand so well, and despite only appearing in about half of the game, Egil still leaves such a big impact. I love that his sacrifice was to save you specifically, and of course, I have to mention that he has some of the most memorable lines in the entire game. Overall, Egil does have a short amount of screen time, which does hurt him when it comes to how fleshed out he is and how much he gets to shine. But honestly, I think the way Egil was used in this story is as close to perfect as you can get. For me specifically though, there is just no competing with these next two villains. This top 2 was painful to decide. I genuinely wanted to put both of these characters on number 1 at some point. But after many days of thinking about this, I gave the number 2 spot to Melos. I feel like he's one of the most beloved villains and one of the most beloved Xenoblade characters in general by hardcore fans. And yet, every now and then, I still see some people call Melos a one-note or just bad villain. Granted, Melos is from Xenoblade 2, people will find any reason to hate on that game, but just in case there are any Melos detractors watching this video, let me explain why I and so many other people love this guy. Well, let's just get one of the obvious reasons out of the way. Melos is one of the most charismatic characters in the entire Xenoblade series.
Indeed!
His voice acting and over-the-top mannerisms just gave us so many memorable moments and voice lines. Like, I can't even make this up, Melos has his own Vine Boom sound effect.
I don't give a rat's ass what you think, brat!
Don't get me wrong, I like Melos because he's funny, but I also like him because he's a very interesting character. People often call him one-dimensional, and I can see why he leaves that impression at first, but he's far from it. Melos doesn't have a sympathetic backstory that explains why he commits his wrongdoings. And yes, in a way, he really was born evil. Blades usually share some traits with the driver that awakened them, so it's very likely that Melos inherited his hatred for humanity from Amalthus. Melos gets aware of this over time, and does wonder whether his thirst for destruction actually comes from someone else. Despite his goofy antics, he can get very existential, which plays a big part in his character development. Melos' main struggle becomes about his identity. Back in his Torna days, he had a blast doing whatever came naturally to him, and he was fully convinced that this is what he was made for. But 500 years later in the base game, he eventually realizes that those destructive ideas are maybe someone else's. And yet, he keeps going, like a robot forced to obey its programming. Whenever Melos confronts Pyra or Mithra, he always tries to convince them that they, as Aegises, were made to destroy the world. And with this, he's as much trying to convince himself. Melos is almost desperate to validate what his purpose for existing is. And it turns out that Jin actually played a big part in this. Melos expresses empathy towards him many times, but only after Jin died can you see just how much Melos actually cared. He hated to see how much Jin had to suffer because of the cruel world they live in. And yet, Melos only used that empathy for Jin to justify his initial beliefs, that he does want to destroy this cruel world after all. This is what I mean when I say that Melos is far from one-dimensional. In the Torna days, he enjoyed being evil, but during the final battle of Xenoblade 2, Melos shows regret of the path he chose. He realizes that he's part of the reason this world became a wretched place, and calls himself a monster far beyond saving. And yet, despite all those doubts about his purpose, despite his regrets and the guilt he feels, he doesn't even try to redeem himself. Because according to Melos, that's not his role in this world. I'm not sure how many people will agree on this, but Melos is a tragic villain to some extent, even if he doesn't have anything resembling a sad backstory. Melos simply lived his whole life believing or convincing himself that it's his purpose to be the Endbringer. Seeing as Amalthus was so against the idea of people changing, it's possible that Melos never even believed that he himself could change. With his final moments, Melos just gets me thinking in a way few other characters can. Was he truly satisfied with the way he went out? Did he really find a meaning to his life like Morak said? Will we ever see Melos again in the future of the series? God, I hope so! As one final note, I just have to praise Melos' voice actor, David Menken. As mentioned earlier, he put a lot of gusto in his more theatrical moments, while also nailing the emotional screams in the finale.
And how many people died because of it? You'd forgive him just like that?
There is just no villain or character that has quite the same presence as Melos. He's by far the most entertaining and thought-provoking of all antagonists in the series. In fact, Melos is straight up my favorite villain, together with my number one. But after a lot of deliberations, I decided to put Melos on the lower spot of the two. But before we get to that, let's do the honorable mentions to make it even more obvious who's the number one. So, I think Metal Face is a perfect example of how pure evil villains can still be effective. He might not be that complex, but the terrible things he does to you basically drive the first half of the story forward. He might be simple, but he served his purpose while having some great voice acting. Next up, I have Amalthus, who's basically the true villain of Xenoblade 2. I love the idea behind him. A man that lost everything at a young age and then grew more nihilistic after seeing the corrupt actions of humans again and again. It's just perfect for the story of Xenoblade 2. Many of his quotes also have great meme potential, while they're sadly applicable to real life as well at times. He's not as charismatic or memorable as Jin or Malos, but still, he deserves some respect. And finally, there's Zanza. I like Klaus as a character a lot, but Zanza always felt like a separate, more one-note entity. I do like how he's responsible for the biggest plot twist in Xenoblade 1, and he does act as a good foil for Shulk. And this is where I'm gonna shout out this character analysis from Phantom Height. It does a great job analyzing both Shulk and Zanza. I still think he's not the most compelling villain, but I do appreciate how Zanza basically goes against all the themes of the first Xenoblade. And now, let's get on to the actual number one. Just like Xenoblade X, Xenoblade 3 often gets criticized for having weak villains. But to be honest, I think Moebius as a whole is okay. Most of the consoles are not memorable at all, but they were never meant to be. They're decent plot devices for whatever hero quest they're in. Just nothing more than that, and that's fine. But then there's the standout between them. Console N. N is just an effective and compelling villain from the moment he's introduced. First, there's a sense of mystery with him. He's obviously connected to Noah, but raises questions like, how are there two of them, and why is this one evil? Well, let's get into that. Just like any soldier in Ionios, Noah keeps getting reincarnated. And yet, you can say he suffers more than the average Cavesian. Every lifetime, he's destined to fall in love with Mio, only for both of them to perish in the process of fighting Moebius. The two of them even had a child at some point, but had to leave him behind at a young age when they reached the end of their lifespans. After a while, Console Z confronted Noah with this painful cycle and offered him a chance to join Moebius with Mio. While Zed was pressuring him, Noah still chose to accept his first task out of his own will. He had to destroy the city, a place with some of his own descendants living in it. It turns out he merely wanted to stop Alpha, but in a cruel twist of fate, Noah accidentally killed his own son. This is where Noah really turned into Console N, because it marked a point of no return for him. How can you possibly back down after slaughtering your own son? A nice attention to detail is that N's eyes start to look emotionless from this point onwards. After sacrificing so much for an eternal life with Mio, he's left almost a shell of a man. What N didn't realize, or didn't want to admit, is that by forcing M into Moebius, she became as miserable as she could be. In chapter 5, she finally found a way out of her life, and she was hoping that her death would make N see the error in his ways. But of course, N didn't take it that well. N is built up as this composed and menacing villain that almost never shows emotion. But after he realizes M is gone, we see shock, desperation, anger, and hysterical laughter. His breakdown is one of the most iconic scenes in the game, which is really sold by his facial animations and the great voice acting of Harry McIntyre. N really goes through the 5 stages of grief here, but he misses the most important step: acceptance. He can't accept that M wanted this and just blames Noah for her death. He can't accept that he chose the wrong path by becoming Moebius and that everything he did was now for nothing. And insists that it's impossible to change the world for the better, as he himself tried it before. As Noah says, N stopped trying. He keeps walking this miserable path because he doesn't see a better future for himself. As usual, it's only at the end of the game where your characters have found the right answers and where you can get the antagonist to listen by beating the crap out of them. Noah and Mio can finally show how M truly felt, and it gets through to N. He can finally accept that he regrets his past actions and can start forgiving himself. N is now given an opportunity to start over and move forward again, and with his first genuine smiling forever, he doesn't pass up on that offer. As I said earlier, I think N is a great villain for many reasons. He's mysterious and menacing at the beginning, has a memorable crash out and a heartfelt redemption. But on top of all that, N just embodies what I like the most about these sympathetic villains. While you obviously shouldn't excuse N or these other characters for the terrible things they've done, I just think that these types of villains work perfectly in the kinds of stories that Xenoblade tries to tell. All the games take place in worlds with many kinds of hardships, and what defines most major antagonists is that they give in to despair. The pain becomes too much for them, or they let their fear control them, and they start lashing out towards others. The protagonists always show that people can overcome those hardships and find that hope again. So I appreciate that N shows even the kindest and strongest people can just as easily lose their way. This version of Noah has made wrong choices and committed atrocities that he thought he could never go back from. But even with the heavy burdens he had to carry and all he sacrificed for Moebius, N finally managed to move on from the past. He found the courage to change and to move forwards again, even if he regrets his previous actions or if the future looks uncertain. N just feels like the ultimate Xenoblade villain to me. On top of playing such a memorable role in the story of 3, he also just embodies so many of the themes and messages from all the previous games and villains in the series. That is why N is my #1 favorite Xenoblade antagonist. Thanks for watching. If you think the video deserves it, consider leaving a like. It took me way longer than expected to accurately put my thoughts on all of these characters into words, but I am finally happy with how this top 5 turned out. Anyways, subscribe for more Xenoblade content. This has been Maxmonado signing out.